the link and then yes. So good morning, everyone. Today we have Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, who is going to lay out the main arguments of his book, which he has recently published, and the book is here. It's titled Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, Mapping an Alternative Global Future. This book could not have come at a more opportune time. And since all of you know, the world is going through a great geopolitical change. And and he has written, although his book was published a little before the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, but nonetheless, he has covered almost all elements of geopolitical change that we see today. And so he is going to make a small presentation of his book. And if I may introduce Ambassador Yogendra Kumar very briefly. Ambassador Kumar had a long career as an IFS officer. He joined the IFS in 1977 and began his diplomatic career in Moscow, subsequently serving in Indian diplomatic missions in London, Islamabad, and Brussels, covering the EU, EC, that is European Commission, Belgium, and Luxembourg. In between serving at headquarters in Delhi, he headed the Indian Consulate General in Tashkent, covering the entire Soviet Central Asia. He later served as ambassador in Tajikistan between 2000 and 2003, where he also covered Afghanistan until the opening of the resident mission there. He was High Commissioner in Namibia and retired in 2012 as ambassador in the Philippines with concurrent accreditation to Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Among his numerous assignments at headquarters, he handled multilateral organizations, dialogues such as G8, G5 dialogue, ASEAN, IPSA, IORA, and many others. He was on the faculty of the National Defense College, New Delhi, which is part of Ministry of Defense. Since retirement, he has been participating in national and international conferences, writing in newspapers, specialist journals, and contributing chapters to edited volumes, and speaking on foreign and security affairs to diverse audiences. He has authored a book titled Diplomatic Dimension of Maritime Challenges for India in the 21st Century, which was published in 2015, and edited and contributed to another publication, that is Whether Indian Ocean Maritime Order, which was published in 2017. So with these few introductory remarks, may I please invite Ambassador Yogendra Kumar to please share the main arguments of your book. Maybe you can take 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we have two panelists. One of my colleagues, Dr. Ankur Yadav, an expert on international relations. He is going to comment and shed some lights on the subject. And apart from him, I am also one of the panelists. And then after that, we'll throw this platform for questions and audience from the question and comments from the audience. And over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. In fact, very briefly, I cover Ukraine in my book, and I didn't know that all that I write about very tragically will come to the fore in this particular manner that we see. Professor Ajay Dubey, rector of Jawaharlal University in absentia, Dr. Lakshman Behra, associate professor JNU, Dr. Ankur Yadav, assistant professor JNU, Dr. Gaurav Tyagi, assistant professor JNU, and distinguished participants. I wish to thank the Special Center for National Security Studies at this prestigious university, a veritable thought leader in the country, to make this webinar possible and to have brought together such a distinguished group of scholars on the theme of my book. Apart from associating the university in different ways, I also want to acknowledge the help of Professor Madhan Palat in looking at the draft of some of my important chapters on European geopolitics. I wish to thank especially Professor Ajay Dubey, rector of the university, for making this webinar possible today. And I wish to thank Dr. Behra, who spent this precious time to put this event together. So what the larger approach to the book's analysis of contemporary geopolitics? While it will be true for the Indian diplomats of previous generation, I have seen quite dramatic and precipitate geopolitical developments during my years in the Foreign Service. The inflection phase at practically every twist and turn have been rather short and quite starkly unanticipated, raising questions about the very operating presuppositions underlying the expectations about the direction of global affairs. When I reached Moscow in 1979, the global order was largely bipolar, with the Atlantic being the fulcrum of the global balance of power, with other regional power equations in essence being conditioned by the operation of this power relationship. It seemed destined to remain forever, despite the brooding rhetoric about the nuclear apocalypse. All developments, be they political or economic or social, seem to be flowing from this primary confrontation with some ground rules for coexistence. The ideological underpinning to this confrontation/coexistence was quite neat and believed with an unshakable certitude in the two camps and their affiliates in different parts of the world. But it did not take very long for this cozy understanding of the drivers of geopolitics to unravel, creating yet another kind of certitude about the viability of yet another kind of global order, which turned out to be even shorter than that of the Cold War era. And this short-term global order has been succeeded by what is now described as global disorder, bringing into question not just the precept of IR theory, as well as the familiar approaches towards the conceptualization of geopolitics, but the underlying assumptions of social theory itself, or the wider issue of episteme or even ontology, or shall we say further, even basic questions as to how we define ourselves in terms of our identities. This intellectual turn is the more remarkable when we consider that the US-USSR détente was a conscious decision of the key political leaders of the day. The almost universally shared expectation then was that of a world at peace with itself, constituted largely of democratic systems, high economic growth, and driven by entrepreneurial spirit of the man in the street. This early foundational superpower bonhomie notwithstanding, and with technology propelling communities ever closer at lightning speed, situating astride individuals and social groups without adequate acculturation, the international institutions, as well as the regional, national, and even subnational institutions, have been unable to steward this transition. Questions being raised are about degrading and failing institutional capacities, which are becoming a challenge multipliers for this very reason. The focus of exploration, in my view, needs to be about the nature of power transitions, or regime change, if you will. As I observed and mulled over the rapid geopolitical changes in the end phase of the Cold War and its twists and turns since, I followed up on the intellectual discourse accompanying these changes and the evolution. The phrase which struck me was that of the geopoliticist Simon Dalby, who spoke of the pervasive, and I quote, vertiginous unease about the shape of the future world and the continuing quest for, I quote again, the geopolitical certainty in which the basic components of geopolitics can be clearly demarcated, known, and hence controlled, unquote. The methodological conundrums in the analysis of the unfolding geopolitics are best summed up, in my view, by the authors of US National Intelligence Council report, published in December 2012, projecting global trends up to 2030, and which I call GT 2030. And I just quote from there. The conundrums are examination of outcomes concerning the role of the US in the international system in the situation of a decline or a decisive reassertion in terms of the response of the other powers. Inquiry into the dynamics of governance and exploration of complicated relationships among a diverse set of actors, especially the role of states versus non-state actors. Realization that the trajectory has been to underestimate the rate of change with respect to the trajectories of the rise and decline of different states. Better exploration of the framework of relationship between trends, discontinuities, and crises. Better focus on smaller political psychosocial shifts that do not go under the umbrella of ideology, but drive behavior rather than grand ideologies like fascism or communism. And lastly, better identification of looming disequilibria. In my exploration of the unanticipated geopolitical twists and turns during the period of this book, I've been struck by their precipitate nature. The massive breakup of the Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, as also the countries elsewhere, framed these and also significantly conditioned them. Collapse and fragile states have meant ruptured social communities, political fragmentation and polarization, splitting of national identities, violence, and even worse. These internal developments spawned destabilizing regional and global geopolitical trends, compounding other pressing challenges arising from technological developments and ecologically unsustainable nature of economic growth at the community and global levels. I have looked at the above methodological conundrums through the understanding of the nature of political transitions. A manifestly successful one is cohesive and based on mass mobilization, which is inclusive, empowering, and ennobling of the powerless and the disadvantaged. Such power transition ensures institutional resilience to cope with the inevitable internal as well as external shocks to a political system. In this exploration, I have, as a parallel running thread, looked at the Gandhian praxis for generating and steering the political transition in India and managing a smooth power transfer in 1947, which ensured resilient political institutions in India conducive for the country's socio-economic progress and its rapidly growing role in international affairs. From this juxtaposition, the conclusion is that the missing component of the IR theoretical and geopolitical writings is a focus on the internal configuration of the political force wielding the levers of state power. Lack of focus on this internal configuration leads to overlooking the drivers of political dynamics which unfold in varying ways in different situations. Their internal configuration fundamentally affects the manner of the manipulation of levers of state power, with profound impact on the functioning of the concerned state system, no less in the current era of globalization. Our theoretical and analytical conundrums can be better understood and resolved in recalling Gandhi's insights about steering a peaceful, cohesive political transformation and power transition, the crafting of inclusive identity across diverse demographic segments, and ensuring the tensile strength of the political and societal institutions during periods of stress and turbulence. So what is this book about? This inevitably means an assessment of the nature of power dynamics generated by the presence or absence of a robust internal democratic party system, which is independent of special interest groups, internal or external. This has a bearing on decision-making mechanism, whether they are gridlocked, whether the implementing institutions are degraded, or whether the political decisions are backed by the commensurate wider community mobilization for their smooth implementation. The other conclusion is that inadequate attention is paid to the effect of state fragility or collapse on the drivers of geopolitical change or its direction, or on the national and regional security milieu. Fragile states or collapsed states experiencing internal conflict and fragmented identities with overlapping ethnic communities with neighboring countries invite interference and manipulation from neighbors and outside powers to protect their strategic equities, making resolution of internal conflict protracted and intractable. This phenomenon has been commented upon the UN Secretary General in respect of various regional conflicts which have gone on for decades, causing widespread bloodshed, social and economic devastation, generating terrorism and transnational crime, externally destabilized refugee outflows, widespread environmental degradation with global ramifications, and collapsed institutional capacities. As the literature grows on escape from state fragility entrapment, one estimate is that by the end of this decade, half the world's poor would be living in collapse or fragile states. The impact on global balance of power equations, with deepening geopolitical distrust and fracturing of global order in all spheres, is there for all of us to see, as also the manifest incapacity to address common global challenges. The globalization phenomenon, propelled by the surging force of the lightning pace of the new forms of technology, is experiencing a pushback. It is morphing into deglobalization phenomenon among countries and publics, which remain the former's primary drivers. There is now a broader discourse about the liberal global order having lost its self-validating appeal, which has become even more animated and raucous with the Western failure of the Iraq and Afghanistan projects, where I discuss at length the defilement of the analysts. Amid escalating tension between US, NATO, and Russia, and between China and US, even the red lines of the Cold War are disappearing, and stability agreements of various kinds between US and USSR have been abandoned, and the newer ones are difficult to achieve, especially as the technology scenarios of today are so radically different. With so many moving parts characterizing the global strategic scenario, the consequences of black swan events, and this one can include now, decisions of an individual leader are truly unfathomable. For a growing power with expanding like India, which inhabits a difficult and fragile neighborhood, These drivers of geopolitical dynamics are creating a very different set of foreign policy and security challenges, necessitating an institutional redesign. The book surveys the intellectual foundations of the Western leaders' decisions. Surveys that they were critical in shaping the political forces unleashed by the US-USSR baton. A chapter is devoted to emerging geopolitical writings, which served as a validation of these positions and had an air of triumphalism about them. This chapter includes discussion on the post-Cold War international relations theories, which share with the geopolitical writing the characteristics of de-emphasis on state centrality in the new post-Westphalian global order. This survey is followed by a discussion on the crippling effect of the post-Cold War Western policy of redesigning global institutions and the inability of the newer multilateral institutions created by non-Western powers to build a global institutional structure to meet the growing global challenges. Another chapter is devoted to a discussion on the inability of the political transformations triggered by the end of the Cold War on the considerable impact of the policies of Western powers to address the popular aspirations for uplifting empowerment. The Western emphasis on formulaic approach to political democratization, including administration shock therapy for free market reforms, and critically ignoring the internal democratization of the Soviet Communist Party and the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, despite their pan-national character, resulted in chaotic power transitions, leading to problems that we see all around us. The political space vacated by the dissolved pan-national parties gets crowded by smaller, often individual-led parties and shifting alliances, jostling for grand power bargains, and leading to an anticipated and unanticipated and uncontrolled political developments, with leaders trying frantically to catch up with them. The parallel thread is that of steering on the political transformation of Mahatma Gandhi, leading to India's independence in 1947. The chapter on Gandhian praxis as it relates to nation building and IR theory engages with the same benchmarks which define the current methodological conundrums in understanding power transitions and the geopolitical drivers in today's world. Its universal validity inheres in the enduring quality of a political transformation, which is empowering, inclusive, and ennobling of the weak and the disadvantaged. The Gandhian practice is explored through the drawing of contrast with the current theoretical and political conundrums as to how an inclusive identity can be nurtured, social cohesion fostered, stability and resilience of political institutions ensured, and the quality of governance preserved. His doctrine of non-violence was also translated into a thorough democratization of the Communist Party with the empowerment of its grassroots members, honest and self-sacrificing nature of its leadership, scrupulously public party accounts, capacity for mass non-violent mobilization, and the elite identification with the poorest people. Through this instrumentality, he was able to launch a non-violent independence struggle at a time when it was likely to take a violent course. Armed with experience of constructive community development experience and its democratic culture, the party swiftly moved into its governance role, and despite the daunting challenge of 1949-47, quickly embarked on political consolidation of an infant state through resilient institutions. Equally relevant in the current context of recurring bouts of state collapse in Afghanistan is the political legacy of highly successful non-violent mobilization of the Pashtun communities by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Interweaving these parallel strands into the narrative, the book charts an alternate approach towards our common global future. Cognizant of the absence of any causative factors to turn things around even in the medium term, and that the alternative futures are of an aspirational nature, it draws lessons from Gandhian praxis of steering a cohesive and empowering political transformation. The chapter on our options assesses the powerful state of geopolitics and balance of power challenges, destabilized nature of newer weapons technology, ineffectiveness of global institutions, climate change, and state fragility. It also surveys the current discourse on escaping the state fragility trap and on the application of the reflexive template based on the self-same Western intellectual predispositions of pressuring the stakeholders to somehow hold national election as soon as possible, or to use another expression, to set up a pop-up democracy after a political settlement. There's no attention, unlike the Gandhian praxis, on the robustness of internal democracy of political parties, devoid of business politics nexus in the contending political parties. The challenges before India are also discussed given its tough neighborhood, highly unsatisfactory regional integration, underdevelopment and demographic imbalances, with overlapping communities across unnatural borders, expanding reach of jihadist terrorism, and challenges of providing opportunities for a large and highly aspirational youth population in South Asia. The current geopolitical scenario in South Asia requires strategic relationships and external balancing for India, based on strength and institutional capacities, including military and security, in a highly fluid, unpredictable geopolitical twists and turns in the region and beyond. As it must do all it can to calibrate the statecraft, India's benign, non-disruptive international role can be further strengthened through the inclusion of Mahatma Gandhi's request of the theory and practice of management of political change in his diplomatic role. This messaging can be incorporated in the program of the UN, other global funding institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and other institutional entities. Since the large number of fragile states, a phenomenon shaping current geopolitics, are dependent on external assistance, internal political reforms focused on creation of robustly democratic political parties can be effected by making them a precondition. By putting this focus within the global discourse, it can also provide the right orientation even to mass movements like the Arab Spring, which tend to splinter along narrow agendas or fail or prove themselves to be unable to provide stable governance. The sharpening of the instrumentality of managing political change, either in existing governments or in protest movements, has critical ramification in institutional capacity building, as also in contributing significantly to reduction of geopolitical distrust for the humanity to effectively handle the increasingly menacing nature of the global challenges. The most recent IPCC report on climate change warns about the woeful inadequacy of international effort, whilst underlining the capacity to successfully overcome this challenge. In my concluding paragraph of the book, I mentioned that geopolitics poised in a slender balance, as destabilizing threats gather at a pace which are being underestimated or denied altogether. There are considerable global intellectual and material resources which are available to be marshaled. The choice before the humanity is the one which was pointed out Mahatma Gandhi to the Indians then and to the humanity now. And I just want to conclude by saying that I wrote this book around 2018-19, and the geopolitical trends have worsened since then, as we actually see and as it was mentioned in the introductory remarks. So with that, I thank you for this great opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the beautiful exposition of your book. I think you covered it very well, all the aspects of your book, starting from the triumphalism at the end of Cold War to the present geopolitical churn that we are witnessing. And you also talked about what India could do for the well-being of the world community through the preaching of Gandhian praxis, what you say, Gandhian praxis. I'm sure that the audience, particularly the students, would have benefited immensely from your main thesis of your book. Sir, as I said, we have two panelists, and so in the order of sequence, if I may start with my comments. Before I say anything, so I would like to congratulate Ambassador Yogendra Kumar for writing this very timely book. I think with this book, he has joined the long list of illustrious IFS veterans, starting with Jen Dixit, then Rasgutra, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, Shiv Shankar Menon, Ambassador Gokhale, Arvind Gupta, Nirupama Rao, and of course the present Foreign Secretary Jaishankar, who have immensely contributed to the discourse on India's foreign strategic and national security policy. Being from the National Security Center, we wish that the officials retired, senior officials retiring from the MOD or MHA had actually followed the footsteps of IFS officers, but except for the few armed forces officers, we have not seen senior officials writing books or other literature on the vital aspect of national security. But nonetheless, we have a tremendous amount of literature coming from the IFS community, which I think is very well for the debate and discussion on India's foreign and strategic discourse. Well, Ambassador Kumar's book could not have come at a more opportune time. And as you know, we are witnessing a great deal of global geopolitical churn. And in fact, the global geopolitics is being rewritten as you say, in front of our eyes. The rules of globalization are under a great deal of stress. As I said earlier, Ambassador Kumar started writing his book in 1819, probably finished in 2020. So, but he has covered all the elements of the current geopolitical events, and which, as he rightly said, are actually going on the worst direction. In my comments, I'll just focus on one or two aspects. I think he has covered a bit on in his discussion, in his presentation. Nonetheless, I will highlight some of the key markers of geopolitical change and how they are affecting India's strategic outlook. Now, as Ambassador Kumar said, the post-Cold War started after the disintegration of the Soviet Union in early 90s, and this led to the unipolar movement, with US emerging the sole superpower. And this unipolar movement lasted for about 25 years. And so this unipolar movement has now given way to what many say return of great power competition. Some say it's a new Cold War, and some even say post-Cold War. So there are different names, but the essential aspect is that there are two rival blocs, one led by US and other democratic countries, and other bloc consist of China and Russia. And if you might have heard about John Mearsheimer, a hardcore realist based in US, he in fact predicted that US liberal order won't last long. And his key argument was that US was trying to impose what he says liberal hegemony. And the US thought that by exporting the liberal hegemony and particularly through integrating China and Russia in a liberal economic order, so it will probably lead to political liberalization in both China and Moscow. But China and Russia, they had other things in mind, and they in fact didn't like the political liberalization, and which they resisted, which is being manifested through this great power competition between, as I said, US and Europe on one side, and Russia and China on the other side. So this unipolar movement has come crashing down, and this has led to, and this has opened the way for great power competition. And both the blocs are trying to compete for influence and dominance. And we can see in all aspects of international affairs, be it in economic field or on technology areas, or even ideology, and of course military. In military spheres, both the blocs are competing quite severely. So one can ask when this transition took place from the unipolar movement to great power competition. Well, there is no single marker as to when this started, but there are a couple of events which actually lays the foundation for this transition. And the first one is, of course, the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8 that led to severe economic depression in US and Europe, and in which the China came out quite strongly. China, in fact, was among the one of the big economies which actually weathered the crisis quite well, and that I think gave a lot of confidence to the Chinese leadership. And that confidence, unfortunately, was manifested in Chinese hegemony and military aggression in its periphery, be it South China Sea or East China Sea, or along the Himalayan border with India. So Chinese hegemony, Chinese aggression, and military diplomacy, starting from 2000, we started actually the foundation was laid in 2007-8 global crisis, financial crisis. And the other event was, of course, the 2008 Russian war in Georgia, and then 2014 annexation of Crimea. And in fact, the annexation of Crimea marked the first. This is the first time that one European territory has been actually annexed by another country by force. And so Russia did it without much opposition from the US and Europe. And of course, the present invasion actually has turned the geopolitical table dramatically. And there is a great deal of opposition from the US and Europe, and that we have seen in plenty. Now, one aspect of this great power competition is that it is actually strengthened the alliance on both sides. Now, Russia and China, just prior to the invasion of Ukraine, declared an alliance of no limit, with no limits. So they can go to any extent of opposing US-led international order, and that is what we see unfolding before our eyes. And if somebody follows the Chinese media, and we would see that how Chinese leadership actually laying the foundation for the Chinese population to believe that this war is actually the fault of NATO or the US, and that is the narrative that is being that is there in the US, and that is supported by the Chinese leadership, and that in turn shows that they're hand in hand with Russia and in this invasion. And of course, on the US side, we have seen the alliance being strengthened quite a bit. And so the alliance system, which was marked by NATO, has come out very strongly in opposing the Russian invasion. Of course, they have declared not to fight Russia military, but falling short of fighting directly, they are doing everything possible. But the one key noticeable change is the Europe's response to Russian aggression. So earlier, and nothing actually shows more dramatically than the German response to Russian aggression. So before the aggression, so people the critic of German leadership or political critics of Germany used to say that Germany had outsourced its security to the United States, its energy needs to Russia, and its export-led growth to China. So that was the usual critique of Germany. But if you look at the response, particularly from Germany, so there is a dramatic change. So initially, Germany gifted only helmets, but after the invasion, they have not only given lethal weapons to Ukrainian forces, but they have cancelled the gas pipeline which was coming from Russia to Germany. And the biggest event was, of course, the German leadership's declaration of strengthening, of increasing their dramatic increase in their military expenditure. I think more than 100 billion euros or dollar. That is what they are going to spend on their military. So Germany is actually rearming, and that actually shows that will contribute hugely to the NATO's military capability. And on the US side also, we have seen US promoting the alliance and increasing focus on partnership. And so NATO, of course, is there. And then we have seen AUKUS and the revitalization of Quad, which has a tremendous impact on India. So the point is, where does all these global geopolitics leave India? Of course, India is not in a very happy situation. In fact, the situation is quite critical. On one side, Russia is India's biggest weapon supplier. Russia has been the traditional supporter of India throughout the Cold War, and it continues to supply a large amount of weapons to India. And even if India wants to disassociate, it can't because of the dependency on weapons. But at the same time, US is also India's biggest strategic partner, especially in countering Chinese hegemony and military aggression. And India is, of course, part of the Quad, and India has strategic partnership with all US allies or partners, with Australia or Japan or UK or France, so which are opposed to Russia. So balancing maintaining a fine balance between Russia and US has not been easy. And last night, in fact, yesterday, we saw India changing its stand from tacitly supporting Russia to actually openly now opposing. So the abstention in the UN General Assembly vote was taken as opposing Russia. So the India's stand has been changing, but I think going forward, India's stand will get further complicated because of the China factor. So Russia has been the biggest partner, or China has been the biggest partner of Russia, and China is the biggest strategic enemy or strategic challenger for India. So if there is a conflict in the future between India and China, so I don't think Russia will openly support India, because Russia is now considered the junior partner of China, and they are hugely dependent on Chinese economy and Chinese support. So in that case, India has to tread a difficult path, and it is not very easy. And so, in fact, I was reading somewhere that if China is India's biggest strategic rival, and if Moscow is Russia's biggest supporter of China, so enemy's friend cannot be a friend forever. So we have seen that Hegelian philosophy: enemies is always a friend, but enemy's friend can never can hardly be a friend. So Russia has been a friend, not because of China, but because of other reasons for a long time throughout the Cold War. But given its dependence on China, so how long Russia or India they will maintain a cordial relationship is a big question. And I think with that I will stop. And I will invite my colleague, Dr. Ankur Yadav, who is an expert of international relations, to shed some lights and to contribute to the discussion. Over to you, Dr. Ankur.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshman, and thank you, Mr. Yogendra Kumar, for your presentation and also giving the summary of the book. And congratulations. I think, as Dr. Lakshman said, this is the right time, not only in a geopolitical perspective, but also from the Indian perspective, it was very much important to give the narratives and ideas from Indian scholars, from the scholars from the history and activists from the historian. So the book is, I think, somehow in a right time to presenting India's narrative in the world level, specifically the Gandhian thoughts, which is of course discussed all over the world, but this is somehow you are presenting a very different perspective. From the past 2 decades, there have been growing call for broadening the discipline of IR by giving due recognition of history, cultural idea, agency of non-Western state and societies. But it was not easy for the Eastern scholar or a scholar from Global South to come out from this Western domination of IR. So somehow this book is coming on the right time and putting their Indian narrative in the world state.
Yes, sir.
The debate was started from the growing dissatisfaction by the non-Western scholars with the Western dominance of IR field, a dominance that marginalized the past and recent contribution of other societies, specifically from the third world. Another opportunity we can see that, of course, the failure of global institution, as you explained very well in your book, which is not able to face the global challenges right now. For example, the COVID-19 and of course the present crisis, Russia and Ukraine. So the present global institutions are not able to handle these challenges, which is coming in front of these institutions, which is somehow pushing scholars to find out an alternative way to deal with these challenges. And the second point is that the emergence of Asian power also somehow putting challenges in front of this Western domination of IR. This debate was started also from the SIS. Of course, different diplomats were writing on that, but from SIS it started from 70s, and now I think it is we can recognize some scholars who are continuously writing on this field. So these primary voices were coming from non-Western scholars and challenging this dominance. These include not just scholars from post-colonialism or race, but also the working of English school and constructivist and post-Western tradition. These dissenting perspectives have called for IR scholar to look beyond the European and US history, because the present IR, which we are seeing, it is very much centered from the European history. Even in India also, we are studying European history, European wars, but we are not looking the same incident from our perspective or not putting our own narrative. But this movement is started from different countries in ASEAN countries also. I know I am familiar with one project which is writing about the Vietnam War, but not the narrative of superpowers or bipolar world. They are going to put their own narrative for the Vietnamese War. So of course, the major argument of this is that the IR should instead draw from the broader canvas of the world history for a long-term perspective. Several aspects of this trend are noteworthy, and this book is contributing on IR in this aspect. And Mr. Yogendra Kumar analyzed the growing inability of global institutions to cope with the contemporary challenges like terrorism, failed state, environment, economic crisis, health crisis, and many other such crises. He argued that the answer lies in a Gandhian approach to steering political change and highlighting the enduring relevance of Gandhian idea. So of course, the Gandhi's idea was always debated in international politics, but the acceptance is not there for different regions. So somehow this book is contributing on that present global scenario somehow again giving us opportunity to think not only from the perspective of state sovereignty and power politics, but also from different opinion, which is presented by this book. So in my opinion or my comment, the book is filling the research gap in a three ways. First, on the global scenario, it is highlighting the debate on the Western domination of IR, global institution, and also mentioning the failure of the global institution. As rightly mentioned by Dr. Behra, that the realist thinker John J. Mearsheimer wrote about the failure of Western liberal order with the title Bound to Fail. So a realist is saying that the order which we were carrying during the Cold War or after disintegration of Soviet Union, it was bound to fail, the rise and fall of liberal international order. So of course, we can see that even the Western scholars are coming such kind of argument, and we can find plenty of literature and reports as mentioned by Ambassador Yadav in his book, Ambassador Kumar in his book. And of course, after the disintegration of Soviet Union, the debate over the New World Order and its justification by the writing like Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. But if we'll read the present writing of Francis Fukuyama, we can take an example of last week Foreign Affairs article by Francis Fukuyama. So he was also somehow saying and mentioning about this debate about nationalism and internationalism. These debates you can find easily in Indian scholars like Gandhi, Arvind Ghosh, Rabindranath Tagore. Plenty of literature is available which is talking that coping with the nationalism, how can we come out for the internationalism? So of course, Indian literature is having a lot of things to discuss and deal with it. So I would like to quote Francis Fukuyama, the subheading of that, liberalism is spiritual vacuum. So of course, he is mentioning about this, and then he is saying that I will quote now, the liberal claim of universalism can be hard to reconcile with a world divided into nation state. So he wants to argue that, of course, liberalism is there, but we need to accept the nation state or idea of nationalism in somehow. So Indian thinker talk about it, balancing nationalism with internationalism. There is a lot to fill this spiritual vacuum, which is taught by Francis Fukuyama. The second point, the first point is that in the global vacuum, we can fill this from the Indian literature. The second point is, of course, the emergence of Asian power, which is like putting challenge of Western IR and coming from different schools like Chinese school or Indian scholars is coming with the Indian school. I would like to quote from the book in the conclusion, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar writing, I will quote now, the Chinese school explored the relationship between China and international society. The Indian writing, specifically those of Tagore, Savarkar, Arvind Ghosh, and Gandhi, place greater emphasis on normative aspect of individual and society over that of a state. So of course, there are different schools emerging in the global south, but in these schools also, we need to see different dimension of their own histories. I told the example of Vietnam. Of course, I will the Amitabh Acharya writing, which is talking about comparative historiography. So we need to see in a comparative perspective that how the Chinese school is coming and what is their own focus. And in the Indian tradition and Indian philosophy, we are seeing that it is more focused on the individual perspective, the peace and democratic values. The third point I would like to make, a country-specific historical thinker and activist and their thoughts about world politics and international institutions, which is very much important. And we have a lot in this aspect also. We have a long list of the scholars and writers in 19th and 20th century. And before that also, our scholars were talking about the international peace going with the nationalism and following this idea of internationalism. It is broadening, of course. The one contributor in this field, I would like to mention about Kanti Bajpayee and Siddharth Malavarappu. In the book titled India's International and Strategic Thought, they analyze two questions. Does India have a tradition of international thought in modern period? It is very important to analyze this, and this book is contributing on that direction. the Vajpayee and Siddharth Malavarepu contribution was there, that they came with the original writing and try to promote other scholars to write about these particular thinkers or activists about their ideas of national politics and international politics. So of course, this book somehow is answering that question. And the other question was that, does it have influential and proactive thinkers who have written illuminately about international life and India's place in it? So of course, the second question is also dealt with the book of Ambassador Kumar. They expert in that book, they came with the 7 personality. Of course, Gandhi was also there. So somehow the book is putting in this, these 2 questions are answered. So these are my comments, and I have some queries. So I think I will wait for the question and answer session. Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar, Dr. Lachman.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Yadav, for your exposition on the subject and enriching the discussion. Introduce yourself, and if it is comment, then say, or otherwise you can straight away put the questions to Ambassador Kumar. Prasama, you want to say something?
Hello, sir.
I thought you were saying.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. My name is Prasham. I am a PhD scholar here at the Special Center for National Security Studies. So my background is majorly economics and international relations. As sir mentioned, Ankur sir mentioned about Francis Fukuyama and the narrative that South Asian or the global South is putting towards its own story. In that regard, we are seeing in today's time a great assertion, especially in the past 7-8 years. We're seeing a great assertion of how India can be can be dogmatic and use situations of geopolitical crisis to its advantage. But my question is that crises pass, and once they pass, this importance that is given to swing states during the time of crisis does not. It's not. You're given the due importance during the time of crisis, but once the crisis pass, then in the international forum, if you take wrong decisions at the present time, or if you take decisions which are not very forward looking, they can land you in a lot of trouble. And so my question to you is basically, how in your book have you tried to address this issue, if any, of being a swing state, especially when India in today's time is a country that almost everyone is referring to and wants support from? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Prashant. So would you like to take answer this question, or take
Sure.
2-3 questions together and then answer?
I'll answer because it becomes a little conversational in that sense. I think these are excellent questions, and maybe I can also cover some of the comments made earlier. So I think the question which Prasham has raised actually is an important one. So in my book, actually, in my last chapter on the options, I do mention that India actually is an important country. So it is not important in the sense that, let's say a smaller country, you think about, I talk about any country for that matter, Pakistan or whichever other smaller country you can think about, where in a given situation, they certainly have a certain role. But India is a swing state in the sense, or if you call it, actually, I don't like the word swing state, but even if you call it that way, the fact is that India actually is a constituent of the global balance of power. So that requirement of actually seeing as to how the global balance of power has to be managed, that requirement is not going to disappear, and it's not contingent upon the let's say unfolding of a crisis or its passage. So for example, I give you one example here. I mean, now of course we know that we are under criticism in the West, in Western Europe and US and perhaps Japan also, most probably, that we are being rather neutral. I mean, the word used is neutral on the Ukraine crisis. But it hasn't meant that the Quad has become weaker. Yes, there's one point I noticed, that the AUKUS now actually is now in a way is a revival of the earlier traditional axis which actually had developed, UK, Australia, and US actually joining. That was actually an old thing. I mean, even the Vietnam War, that kind of axis was there. So there is an attempt now, because of the fact that they're talking about not only sharing the nuclear submarine technology, which actually is very interesting, because actually here they're using weapons-grade nuclear material for actually for the nuclear submarine actually to work. So, but also now they're talking, just recently announced hypersonic weapons technology being passed on to Australia. So in one way, that kind of a role, which was actually initially was being thought of, perhaps, as Andrew said, in the case of Quad, that actually is now in a way being taken over by AUKUS, let's put it like that. But the Quad hasn't become irrelevant, nor has the Malabar exercise become irrelevant. And Malabar actually in a way is a mirror image of the Quad. So contrary to what people have stopped talking about that, the fact, I mean, it's so clear that Quad has a certain role, is important. It's a geopolitical role, but also economic role, and a different perspective, a different vision as to how, let's say, the Asian geopolitics needs to be shaped. And Asian geopolitics shaping means that also the global geopolitics will be shaped. But also there's a mirror in the form of the Malabar exercises. And these exercises are highly sophisticated. I mean, they bring in nuclear submarines, they actually have aircraft carriers and their carrier task forces and so on and so forth. It's actually highly significant. So I would actually say, and the point really is very simple. Yes, what's happened in Ukraine is something which concerns them, but it also concerns us in terms of ramifications. But the other issues of the geopolitical flux that we're talking about, in the geopolitical flux, India still has a place. So I do not think that this is going to change. Yes, of course, it become more, the grounds become more slippery. Like I think when we voted for this UNGA resolution to expel Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, at least the paper that I'm reading, the Russian ambassador actually went and called the Foreign Office and said that it have consequences in bilateral relations. We shall see. Because the same threat has been given to us by the Americans, that when the Deputy National Security Advisor came to India, is that if we don't follow our sanctions regime, there'll be consequences. So we're getting this threat of consequences on different sides. But the fact of the matter is that that's where I said, and that's where actually the nub of my book really is, that if you are internally resilient, if you're internally cohesive, and if you're not a failed or a broken down state, then you are actually relevant in all situations. That is important, because, I mean, why is it that you find the sudden parade of foreign dignitaries landing up in India, whether it's Wang Yi or Lavrov, or it is the British Foreign Secretary or the American or the Dutch, and so on and so forth, and some more are coming actually, and now the Prime Minister is going. So why is that happening? They are not going to other countries. Simple. So that actually gives you a bit of a different way of looking as to what it is. But the important point is that here our resilience is very important. That if we become dependent in a way, I mean, we actually are dependent, but the dependence actually has to be diminished. Only if you are less dependent will your autonomy of action will actually become much broader in its scope. So that's one point. Now, the other point which was made by Dr. Behra regarding Mearsheimer's point. You see, my book actually basically talks about this, I mean, you can take a theoretical, ideological construct you can put and say liberal hegemony is this, that, and the other. But the irony, as I mentioned in my book, is this, that the Russian people, the Soviet people, they wanted that liberal order. That is why Gorbachev could succeed to the extent that he did. That's why Yeltsin could succeed to the extent that he could. But because the fact, and there's a point in my book, because the fact that they became so formulaic in their approach in helping Gorbachev manage that political transformation, that you find a completely unanticipated turn of events take place, where you find that the Russian leaders, beginning with Soviet leader Gorbachev, Russian leaders are actually trying to jump through the hoops to actually keep abreast of the development which actually out of their control. Something which you find in the case of India, when India was actually preparing itself for independence, despite the fact that we had conflicting geopolitical interests on the part of the British, and then of course the Muslim League and so on and so forth, yet we were able to manage and control the political events at that time very largely. So because of the fact that you find that this formulaic approach, because of that you find the events getting out of control, and that is really the answer to much humor, in my view. In fact, the Chinese in a way very interesting. The Chinese are talking about Ukraine now, and the party schools are discussing this issue, and they're talking about Gorbachev's historical nihilism and so on and so forth. So in one way, what they're saying is that Ukraine's crisis is an outgrowth of the failed policies of Gorbachev. My point is the same, but from a different perspective. And the Chinese have no answer to that. How do you manage that kind of political transformation, which is cohesive, which is inclusive, which is empowering? You can't manage that. That is the issue, and that's why this problem arises. And the same thing about ideological blind spot. I mean, why did the global financial crisis take place? It took place because of the fact that the IMF, in fact, I quote my book, that they analyzed why they failed in that. And they talk about what they call, they're the inspectors of the IMF as to why the IMF failed in anticipating the global financial crisis of 2008. And they say it's the intellectual capture and of course the political manipulation. So, and that is formulaic. That's the whole point when I talk about the NIC, the GT 2030, that the formulaic approach is what is creating this kind of unpredictability and the fault lines and the state and non-state actors and so on and so forth. And is that ideological approach because of which they weakened the UN, they weakened the IMF, they weakened the World Bank, they weakened the WTO, and then you have the Chinese saying, okay, we are bringing up parallel structures. The Russians saying we bring up parallel structures, but they are not in a position to play the role that the UN and all the affiliate organizations were able to do at the end of the Second World War. So you find that there is an ideological blind spot. And that is why the original thinking which you find in Gandhi and the people at that time actually was to see as to how you steer a political transformation. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other question by anybody?
Sir, I have a question, sir.
Yeah, Saral, go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. My question was on the future of the multipolar.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
So, sorry, sir. Sir, I'm also a PhD scholar at National Security Studies Center at JNU, sir.
And what are you doing research on?
Sir, I am doing research on Pakistan and Afghanistan, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. But so my question today is actually on the future of the multipolar world order, sir. Why I'm asking this question? Because even External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar also talks about and puts lots of emphasis on multipolar world, where he says that legitimate pursuit of flexibility without seeking exclusivity is actually the operating principle of in a multiple world order. So my question is, sir, we are seeing an example of the Ukraine-Russia war happening right now, and there is a pressure from the US on us and also countries which are sort of like neutral so far on this issue. So my question is, what is the future of the multipolar world order? Because there are arguments of we are heading back or returning to the bloc politics. And what is India's stake and place in that multipolar world order, sir?
So actually, my book has answers to all the questions. So let me just
I'll read it, sir.
In fact, Afghanistan also. I mean, what you talk about Afghanistan. In fact, I mentioned not here, but I mentioned elsewhere that. In fact, I mentioned this. You know, the failure of 20-year-long project in Afghanistan, where the Americans and the Europeans spent trillions of dollars. I think about $3.5 trillion was what they spent on. They lost about 4,500 soldiers. Forget about what happened to the Afghans themselves. I mean, which is a tragic story in itself, a tragic chapter to this project in itself. when the Americans moved in, I was ambassador in Tajikistan, so actually monitoring very closely. When the Americans moved in, they had about 10 to 12,000 special ops. I mean, there are some CIA special ops, there are some of their other expeditionary, these people who actually do this kind of special ops kind of operations. And they had lost about 4 soldiers, and the Alliance lost 5. The 5th one died by mistake, I think some kind of friendly fire, something like that. And they thought, yes, Rumsfeld felt, yes, no, I can take over any country, So, and then when at that time, I'm quoting the American ambassadors, who actually said at that time, the Taliban actually said, so did the Pakistanis, they actually said that, why don't you involve the Taliban? Some kind of power sharing arrangement. I don't know how it would work, but the fact is that was suggested. And Rumsfeld very grandly said, waved his hands off, and said, the US, United States doesn't negotiate a surrender. Now, what was Doha Agreement? Was it not surrender? Simple question. So, when you talk about multipolar order, that's the whole issue. That multipolar order actually assumes that there are constituent elements or constituents of an order, whether it's the US, whether it is China, whether it's something else. But if these constituent units are not functioning states, and that's where you come to Afghanistan again. You don't have a functioning state. What kind of order can you build on a constituent unit that actually has collapsed? It has no agency. It's actually a source of instability to everybody around. Afghanistan is a source of instability to the Pakistanis, of all of them, to Central Asia, to China, to everybody else. So the point is that if the order is collapsing, and that's the point of my book, and when I mention about as to why, again, since we do Afghanistan, the fact of the matter is that there are the overlapping communities, Central Asia, overlapping communities in Pakistan, overlapping communities with Iran. So these countries want to know what's happening, want to manipulate and condition the political process in Afghanistan. And then the others have similar interest because Afghanistan is the way its location is. So the long and short is that if a constituent unit of any order has collapsed, how can you build any order based on that? So in fact, that's the focus of my book, where I actually say that it is all aspirational. It will not happen because the fact it's only going to lead to disorder. And the same thing, and the other point, of course, in the case of any let's say bloc, is some kind of an ideological kind of underpinning. So when you had the NATO, there was ideological underpinning for that. You had the Warsaw Pact, there was ideological underpinning for that. Now, there is no ideology as far as NATO is concerned, frankly. There's no ideology, and the US, of course, they're there now, but the US is not the US of 1945. You talk about US, which actually had just vacated Afghanistan, which actually left Iraq in shambles. And then you have China. China is not an ideological state. They abandoned ideology with Deng Xiaoping. So what Xi Jinping is trying to revive this kind of thing, but they all know that the hold is very limited. Xi Jinping is not like Mao Zedong, who actually dressed up Chinese into their tunics, the drab blue tunics and pajamas to say, okay, now you do what we are telling you to do. He's actually selling them a dream. He's selling them that you will be richer, you will be living better off than the Americans, because latest gadgetry, higher income for the people, and so on and so forth. So again, if you draw a comparison, Mao could have, in the Great Leap Forward and the famine which took place, millions of Chinese died. But Xi Jinping is worried if, for example, the number of casualties or deaths you might have as a result of the COVID crisis, or is worried how many soldiers, PLA soldiers, might die in a clash with India. So what I'm trying to say is that the ideology is gone now. It's not Mao's ideology anymore. It's trying to revive whatever it's doing. So if you're talking about, let's say, blocks of some kind, where is the ideological underpinning in that? Because when the US had the unipolar moment, as was actually quoted by Fukuyama and this Meisinger, as has been quoted, that time to actually show that the US model is actually a growing concern, is a functioning model for everybody. Instead of, as I might quote my book, the pop-up democracy, that you say, okay, you have a fight, you fought, hold election, and thank you very much, we're going. So the point is that in this situation, you cannot actually, you don't have that kind of a, the ideological, that kind of a appeal that you had that time. Of course, now it's more a security issue because Ukraine is located in a place where, the Central European countries, the Western European countries are worried as to how it might unfold further. But beyond that, there is no ideological. I mean, all this talk about democracy, and the question to ask is, okay, democracy, we all are like democracy, but what were we doing for 20 years in Afghanistan? So what I'm trying to say is that, that's why I say that power transitions, political transformation, how is that managed? Is it disruptive? Is it chaotic? Is it violent? Is it polarizing? Is it fragmenting? I mean, that's what you talk about. And that is a failure on the part of the West, because actually I believe that they actually thought that CPSU has been finished. But Gorbachev initially wanted to democratize it. He thought they could be something like a social democratic kind of party, like you have in Sweden, these places. But that's all actually just disappeared. James Baker said about Yugoslavia, we don't have a dog in the fight. So whether the Communist League of Yugoslavia collapses, we don't care. So they're still facing the consequences of that. So that's my point.
Thank you, sir. So we have one research scholar from Jamia Hamdard University.
Okay.
He has put a comment question. So it is there in the chat box. So if you want me to read, I will read it out.
Please read it and read his name. Maybe he can speak. Why doesn't he talk to her? Why doesn't he speak?
Ifra, would you like to put your questions directly? If you are still there.
Yes, sir, I'm there.
Yeah, so you can read out your comment and questions directly to
and tell me who you are.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Ifra. I am a research scholar from Jamia Hamdard.
In what subject? In what subject?
Sir, I just completed my MPhil in Federal Studies, and my topic was citizenship in India, our study of major debates and measures.
The debates and?
Measures.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, now that we know that there's a geopolitical churn after the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the West has imposed sanctions on Russia. Even after that, of course, we'll see a major geopolitical turn after the sanctions being imposed on Russia. Knowing the fact that Russia is also being imposed with the sanctions after the Crimean crisis in 2014. So how will Russia overcome this slew of sanctions being imposed by the US? And also at the same time, we have been seeing India playing a balancing role between the Russia and the Ukraine till now, till yesterday, when it started, criticizing Russia. So we see that India will have some shortcomings after the Russia-Ukraine crisis. How can this be an opportunity? How can India see this as an opportunity at the global order?
I think that's a good question. And I think this is all still, let us say, it all depends as to how the Ukraine crisis will continue to unfold, frankly. So as we can see that there is some kind of a, let's say, stirring in Russia itself as to why the Russians actually have gone into Ukraine. That's the first point. And today, in fact, on the CNN, I was just reading the headlines where they said that Dmitry Peskov, who's Putin's press secretary, he actually has said that it's an unfolding tragedy and significant losses of Russian soldiers. So all that actually, in a way, is coming out, and surely the sanctions will actually are aimed at imposing a cost on the Russian president, but also Russian people. The aim clearly is that by doing that, there will be some kind of popular pressure on the president, but also perhaps the elite, which actually in a way is part of the ruling elite in Russia, that also might begin to fragment because of this kind of situation. And we do know that Roman Abramovich, who is actually a close friend of Putin, also Zelensky, he actually has been trying to mediate between the two sides. So it's a question as to how the crisis will unfold. We just have to wait and see. And therefore, it's very important that we keep our independent options in an unfolding crisis, whose course at the moment is not very clear to everybody. My sense is that perhaps, yes, I think it is petering out a little bit, but still there's a huge human cost, an economic cost, which is being inflicted on the Ukrainian people. And therefore, Ukraine is destroyed, as one can see, actually completely destroyed. Ukraine is destroyed. Nearly half the population is actually has turned into refugee. So how will a country be built? Destruction is easy. Destroying a political system is easy. Building is very difficult. So that cost of that, what will be? So we have to keep our options open. The only point here is that yes, there's pressure on both sides. As I said further, the US national security and deputy national security came and threatened with consequences. Then the Russians threatened with consequences. And you find this kind of thing happening all around. So we have to be actually, that's why I said, if you are strong and resilient internally and cohesive, then we can handle these. That's the whole point of the book. That if you have resilient political institutions, then you can absorb and you will not crack up under the impact of either internal shock or an external shock. For example, 2008 financial crisis. India weathered it better than the Chinese, frankly, because the Chinese spent far more money in terms of the productivity than India did, and our returns were actually very good. And in fact, the IMF has just now complimented India that in the COVID crisis, because the fact that the government launched this free ration scheme for the vulnerable sections of the population, we actually have been able to, in a way, moderate the negative impact of the COVID crisis, which actually has, led to social and economic inequality and all of these kind of things. In fact, because of COVID, there are crises in many places. Sri Lanka is one example, Afghanistan is one example, Pakistan is another, Russia is another example. So many other countries you find this kind of thing happening. So the point actually is that, that's the only way to weather it. But I agree that we are in a difficult situation. And the more sort of resilient and strong we remain as we are, touch wood, I think that's the only way for us to survive. It's not that we will not face negative consequences. We will face negative consequences, but the world moves on. People still need you, and then you say, okay, we will actually see the best that we can do. Yeah.
Okay, sir. So we have 2 more minutes. So if there is no more questions, then can I ask one small question, sir?
Sure, please go ahead.
Sir, this was something I also referred to my discussion. And many people, including Rajamohan, are saying that Russia is a junior partner to China, and they are critically dependent on Chinese support. That we know. So, my question is, what would be Russia's role in a future India-China conflict, and the impact and the future course of India relations? What do you think? Where the relationship will go?
So the question actually is, in a way, it's an interesting question. What would be Russia's role in a future India-China conflict? What would be the US role in a future India-China conflict? What would be Japan's role in India-China conflict? What would be Europe's role in India-China conflict? Let's put it like that. Now, if you take the situation, let's say 1971, when we had a major crisis, then the Russian military role was very different. But when we had the Doklam crisis, or when we had the LAC crisis, the Galwan situation, what was Russia's role? How much did we take from Russia? So my point here is that it is a question of balance. And the other point is that to say that that if Russia is a dependent partner or a junior partner of China, okay, the junior partner of China, but how much do we need from Russia? Number one. Number two, the number two issue is that Russia also needs India because that is one way to balance China. Okay, so in any situation, there will be some balancing required between Russia and China. Never forget that. Russia is a big power. I mean, still, it has tremendous defense capabilities. So my point actually is that of course, the Americans came and scared us, and in a way, it's good that we are more sober about these matters in terms of the Prime Minister said that we need more independent kind of defense capability, because whether it's Russia or China or US, they're all actually basically why they're coming to India. They're coming to India in their own interest. That's a simple fact. So my point actually is that you would still, I cannot imagine that if something like that happens, Russia will say no. They'll still be interested in seeing what we can do. And secondly, how much do we need? What do we need? I mean, we don't want the Russian troops to fight on the LSC. We don't need the American troops to fight the LSC. We just need a certain amount of support, assistance, which we got. We got from Russia, and this is my reading. I have no access to any government discussions or confabulation. Russia was worried about what might happen post Galwan. US was also worried about what might happen post Galwan. So I do not buy these arguments, frankly. But having said that, these are difficult times. So if you become complacent, you become blasé, you become sort of nothing happened to us, then I think we have to keep ourselves sharp-witted, nimble of foot, nimble of wit, and that's the way to survive.
Thank you, sir. So I think we have overshot our time by 2 minutes. Now can I request my colleague Dr. Gaurav Tyagi to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Behra. As rightly pointed out by Chinua Achebe, he was a novelist from Nigeria. Until lions have their own historians, the history of hunt will always glorify the hunter. And in that case itself, the narrative, if it is coming from the horse's mouth itself, who was at the helm of such affairs and decision making, so it is always a pleasure to listen to Ambassador Kumar. And I hope in next semester, when things are good over here in our center, that he comes over here in person and discuss as well as interact with students. That will be good for the center as well as for the faculty itself. I profusely thank Ambassador Kumar for his talk, for his discussion, for his insights on the globalizations and in the era of geopolitics and the era of globalization. And I congratulate him for this benchmark book, and that can be a benchmark for further studies in various centers and in various universities. I sincerely thank Dr. Lakshman Behra also, as well as Dr. Ankur Yadav for a very insightful discussion. And at the end, I would also like to thank participants over there and were engaging in various thought-provoking discussions with Ambassador Kumar. At the end, I would like to thank Professor Ajay Kumar Dubey, Rector and Chairperson of our center. And so I request Ambassador Kumar to take out some time of his busy schedule and if he gets some time to visit our center. Thank you.
Well, I'll be delighted. Thank you very much.
Dr. Tyagi. So that's it, sir. So thank you for taking your time and engaging us and our students in a very thought-provoking discussion. So we would have preferred an offline discussion, but the situation is so that maybe the next time we'll have you in our center and we'll have a person-to-person discussion. Thank you, sir. Thank you all.